Welcome to this online lecture, which is the first lecture in hopefully a long series of lectures where we invite guest speakers to tell us about an interesting topic. The first FRG guest speaker is Gard. Eric will tell us about the impact of exit signage on route choice in emergencies. And it's based on a study that he did together with Johanna Hammarberg, where they did evacuation experiments, so semi-unannounced evacuation experiments using eye track to see how people made decisions. Gard is a fire engineer at Brandskyddslaget AB in Sweden. He has a Master of Science in Risk Engineering and a Bachelor of Science in Fire Safety Engineering, both from Lund University. Now, Eric is interested in human behavior in fire, which is what he studied in his degree. And more specifically, he's interested in route choice in emergencies. And this is what Eric will tell us a bit more about. So Eric, could you please tell us more about your interesting study?
Thank you, Daniel, for that introduction. And now that you already know everything about me, I'm going to dive straight into this presentation. And I did this research together with my colleague Johanna Hammarberg and with co-authors Axel and Daniel. So we began this research by asking ourselves two questions. To what extent do evacuees observe and react to exit signage in evacuation situations? And is there a difference in the evacuee's tendency to observe and react to exit signage depending on its design? And I will give you the answer to these questions, but first I'm going to go through the outline to this presentation. So first I'm going to talk about the past studies, which constitutes the existing knowledge in the field and the foundation for our research. And then I'm going to talk about the method and our experiments that we conducted. And after that, I'm going to go through the results and the discussion and end with the conclusions. So with that said, let's continue with the past studies. So as many of you know, a lot of research have been done in the field of fire safety and evacuation. But when it comes to evacuation experiments in particular and human behavior in fire, past studies have largely relied on the participants' own perception of their actions. And that is especially regarding how they interact with different technical systems, such as signs. So with modern technology like eye tracking, this leaves us room for improvement and potentially new ways of designing evacuation experiments. Additionally, studies have also shown that different types of exit signs can increase the tendency to notice them, which, for example, have been observed with flashing signs. Both flashing blue light and flashing green light next to a sign during evacuations have proven to be better than the regular one. So this is actually the sign that you can see here in the picture. This is one of the signs that is used in one of the past studies. So we have tried to tie these fields together and design evacuation experiments to investigate whether flashing or back illuminated signs are better than the fluorescent ones, and if so, in what way. And other studies we looked into as well have shown that eye tracking glasses can be used in evacuation experiments to obtain a better understanding of what the user is focusing their gaze at during the experiment. And for those of you who don't know, eye tracking glasses is, as you can see in the picture here, basically just a pair of glasses, but with a little more features. They have a front camera as well as some infrared sensors facing the eyes. Those enables us to determine what the user is looking at. This also enables us to identify fixations, which is when the user keeps their eyes relatively still at something for a certain period of time. And they are very important because they are required in order for our brains to register what we are looking at. And this is the technology that we use to determine when our participants observed signs and when they didn't. So it's also important to note that with eye tracking glasses, you don't get virtual reality or augmented reality. It's still just the reality. Their participants were in a real building and only seeing and hearing as well what was actually there. So while they happen to wear the glasses, this helps us get rid of some unwanted behavior that usually appears in virtual reality, for example. So moving on, we started out the experiments by recruiting some volunteers, and we did that by recruiting students at the Lund University School of Engineering. More than 80 students signed up, most of them in the ages between 18 and 25, and they were all unfamiliar with the environment and the location of the experiments, as well as the true purpose of the experiment. So now, of course, you wonder what they thought was the purpose of the experiment, but I will get to that in a minute. So this is the location of the experiments, and the green parts are parallel corridors. The white rooms are individual office rooms, and the numbers 1 to 3 marks the 3 stairwells leading down from the floor. We used the red room on the left as the experiment room, and we equipped it with a fire alarm bell as well as one additional fire alarm bell on each side outside of the room. We also had 11 signs in the corridors marked as green arrows, as you can see in the picture here. And with this design, we made the participants continuously face signs on their way out, and they had the possibility to both ignore and follow the signs, as well as combination of those two. It's also important to note that we had this floor empty to ourselves, so the participants were completely alone, and no one else was inside the offices. So the experiment started out by we guided them to the experiment room from stairwell number 3 to the along the red dotted line to the experiment room, and then we instructed them that their mission or their quest was to play Tetris, the classic arcade game. And so we let them play for approximately 2 minutes. We left them alone. We left the room. After that, after approximately 2 minutes, we started the fire alarm and awaited their reaction. So they could either, take out the glasses or terminate the experiment in any other way, and then we just canceled. But if they did evacuate with the glasses on, the eye tracking glasses recorded their way out and also everything they looked at. So the experiment then ended when they reached one of the 3 stairwells. And immediately afterwards, we conducted a survey with some questions for them regarding their perception of their own behavior. And in order to fully answer the questions that I told you before, we used 3 different sign types, and that were the fluorescent signs, the back illuminated signs, and the flashing signs. And we carried out the experiments with the participants one by one, so they were completely alone, and divided equally of 82 participants, divided equally between the 3 different sign types. And it's also important to note that the signs that we used were flashing or back illuminated themselves, and they had no external lights like the ones in the past studies. And the flashing signs that we used had a frequency of 0.4 Hertz. So moving on to the results, out of our total 82 participants, 68 left the room and gave us some results. And it means that they gave themselves the opportunity to observe and or follow signs. And it also means that 14 participants never left the room, which also means that they stayed in the room for at least 4 minutes after the fire alarms first started ringing. We also analyzed the behavior in the initial phase and compared the results from the survey and the eye tracking. And we concluded that the participants' own perception was that they immediately, when the evacuation started, just looked at some signs and made their way out. However, the eye tracking device shows that they were instead probably looking for others. They were very slow. They waited. They were looking at approximately head height, walking around long before they even started to evacuate, and only much later they observed signs and made their way out. So these columns illustrate the answer to both the questions that I stated before, and the red part illustrates the percentage of the evacuees that only observed signs, while the gray part shows the percentage that both observed and followed these signs. So the number above each column represents the total amount of participants that observed the signs overall. And the first three columns from the left represent each sign type, while the rightmost column is the overall average of all three types. And even though the fluorescent sign performed slightly worse, we could not identify whether the different signs had any significant impact on the tendency to observe or follow them, respectively. So we also examined how long the evacuees fixated their gaze on the different signs. And just to clarify, this corresponds to the total time of fixation on each sign that they actually noticed, not on each sign they could potentially see. And we found that the evacuees focused their gaze significantly longer on the flashing signs, as you can see in the box plot here. And note that this basically means that quite a few participants were actually standing still, more or less staring at the flashing signs. In the survey that we conducted after the experiment, we asked the participants about their height, which we then compared to their tendency to observe signs. The black columns that you can see in the chart here corresponds to the vertical axis on the right and shows the number of people analyzed per height interval. For example, the rightmost column shows that 4 participants were between 190 and 194 centimeters tall. The red line corresponds to the vertical axis on the left and shows the percentage in each interval who noticed at least one sign during their evacuation. And for example here, all 9 participants between 185 and 189 centimeters tall noticed at least one sign. And even though there's a couple of deviant values here and there, and it's not typically linear, we could fit a dotted trend line, as you can see here, and conclude that taller participants to greater extent noticed signs in our experiment. We also gathered information about the evacuees' escape route, and we illustrated that, as you can see in the picture here, a thicker red line means that more people chose that way. So most people chose to evacuate through the left corridor as stairwell number 1, while the second most evacuees chose the right corridor and also stairwell number 1, and only a few of them chose stairwell 2 and 3 via the left corridor. And in summary, a total of 60 participants completed their evacuation to one of the 3 stairwells. And when we studied the survey responses to the question whether they evacuated the same way as they entered, roughly half of them actually had a correct perception of the situation, which also means that half of them didn't know if they escaped through the same way as they entered, or they were just completely wrong. So they were probably disoriented. Moving on to the discussion. How come a total of 14 participants stayed in the room when the alarm sounded? And some of them even continued to play Tetris more than 4 minutes. According to themselves, because we asked them afterwards, they were waiting for us to come back and give them further instructions. And we believe that the instructions we gave them at the beginning of the experiment heavily influenced their willingness to evacuate. But I will get back to that in just a minute. So as presented in the results earlier, the perceived and observed behavior in the initial phase differed between the eye tracking device and the survey. And first of all, it's very difficult to define a certain behavior from analyzing an eye track video, but it was still pretty obvious that the participants were not too interested in the signs in the initial phase. And one possible reason that they still answered that could be that they were either didn't remember and guessed, or that they simply just answered what they thought was the right answer. They wanted to make us happy. And also, as you might have figured out by now, our data could not prove the theory that I talked about before from the past studies, that the flashing signs next to signs have helped during evacuations. And one possible reason for this could be that the signs we used were illuminated or flashing themselves rather than an external light next to the sign. And additionally, the color, frequency, and luminosity were also different from the past studies. And I think it's difficult to draw any specific conclusions as to why these results differ. As I mentioned earlier, we observed that the evacuees tended to fixate their gaze longer on the flashing signs compared to the normal and illuminated ones. And there are, of course, several potential reasons for this. On the one hand, flashing signs could be more efficient in attracting people's attention, which means that they would be better, they could be great conductors of information. On the other hand, flashing signs could be more difficult to see or be perceived as broken, which would make them unreliable. And a couple of participants actually mentioned afterwards that they thought the flashing signs were broken. This difference in fixation time had been observed, but we were not able to determine the reason. And also, even though we concluded that the taller participants to a greater extent noticed signs during our experiments, we should take it with a pinch of salt, because it is, for example, self-evident that a linear fit, like the dotted trend line that I showed you before, has a limited validity. And we think that experiments at a larger scale needs to be conducted in order to draw precise conclusions about the potential correlation between height and the tendency to observe signs. Regarding the evacuees' escape routes, the results indicates that the participants were disoriented, and there are many potential explanations. For example, many of them explained that they did not keep track of how many stairwells they passed on their way to the experiment room. And since the corridors were very repetitive in their design, this could have made them lose track of where they were. And also, we never asked them to try and remember where they were, so the question might have been a bit unfair to begin with. When we analyzed all our data, we got a bunch of numbers, from which we then found the results that I showed you. And what we found especially interesting and actually equally frustrating was that during the experiments we noticed a plethora of different behaviors, which would later turn into the same numbers on paper. And to exemplify, one evacuee were really nervous and had no plan what to do whatsoever. And this person eventually ended up in one of the stairwells after what almost looked like an accidental discovery after wandering across the corridors and happening to noticing a sign or two on the way. Another evacuee was much more calm and collected and strategically waited for us to come back. And when we never showed up, the persons purposefully evacuated and found the closest way out with the help from the signs. And on paper and as well in the results, these two people got the same results regarding waiting time, evacuation time, signs noticed, signs followed, and evacuation route, and so on. And this makes you wonder if the different behaviors affected the values we were able to measure, such as noticing signs or not. And if so, how come we were unable to measure or quantify the different behaviors? At one point, we even doubted ourselves, whether we had asked ourselves the right questions to begin with. We found that the instructions we told them regarding Tetris and the eye tracking equipment, and where we went during the experiment heavily influenced their willingness to evacuate. Out of the first 6 participants that we conducted the experiment on, all of them stayed in the room, none evacuated. This caused us to have a slight panic attack, and we thought that no one was going to evacuate out of all the 82 participants we had recruited. So after redesigning exactly what we told them and considering every word carefully, we managed to get almost everyone after that to evacuate, or at least leave the room. And when we found out about the importance of the instructions, we got curious. How can that piece of information, given before leaving them alone, influence their behavior so much? And how can we extrapolate that result into a real-life application field such as building codes? And how can we build our houses so that something corresponding to the instructions makes people evacuate? Stretching the boundaries and scope of our study, we could not, unfortunately not, continue to investigate this. And lesson learned, it's easy to design evacuation experiments in ways which heavily influence the results. And it's hard to find real-life applications that corresponds to the experiment design. And for now, we leave that for future research. Until next time, I think it's important to carefully weigh every word of the instructions in order to not influence the participants' behavior, but still get them to evacuate. And in conclusion, I think it's way too easy to unconsciously steer the results in a certain direction. To summarize, we came to the following conclusions. Approximately 80% of the evacuees observed signs on their way out, and roughly half of them decided to follow them. It could not be shown whether the different signs had any significant impact on the tendency to observe or follow them. We also found that taller participants observed signs to a greater extent, and fixation times on flashing signs compared to fluorescent and back illuminated signs was significantly longer. We also think that more research is needed to further investigate how different exit signs can impact evacuees' exit choice and behavior. And that actually sums up my presentation for today. So with that said, I want to reach out with a thank you to Johanna and the co-authors, and of course a big thank you to Fire Research Group and Daniel. And as the PowerPoint says, please don't hesitate to contact me if you have any questions. Thank you.